The purpose for us being here tonight, or this afternoon, is to discuss some of the changes that are coming about in our new standard, version 3, which fishery standard, which we published on October 26th, so in about 2 weeks, and then will become effective next May. And we're here to talk about the implications for tuna fisheries, how it'll impact you, your fishing fleets, and your companies. So today I have Dr. Rohan Currey, our Chief Science and Standards Officer with the MSC, and he's going to go through a presentation. I should have introduced myself. I'm Bill Holden, also with the MSC. Rohan will go through a presentation on the implications of the changes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. There are quite a few questions were already pre-submitted prior to this, so I'll kick off that period with those, and then open the floor for those that want to ask questions. So Rohan, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you to everyone for making time to join us for this particular session. Can everyone hear me reasonably clearly? Wonderful. I see people nodding at the back. That's good. Okay. As Bill alluded to, today our topic is to discuss the implications of the new Fisheries Standard, which is a product long in development for tuna fisheries. So I'll be talking you through a number of the relevant changes to the standard, giving you some context, giving you a sense of what those changes are. And we're then going to do a particular deep dive on the topic of harvest strategies, which is something that I know many fisheries have a particular interest in. We've made some significant changes in our standard to that area, and we want to make sure that everyone understands exactly what they will mean in practice. I hope my talk is only about 30 minutes, and thereafter there'll be ample time for questions and then for mingling. So if you don't get a chance to ask a question directly in the Q&A, very happy to pick something up over a drink afterwards. For context, and many of you in this room will know this quite well, but our fisheries standard is a standard that is aimed to assess the sustainability, the environmental sustainability of fish stocks. But it also includes a number of other dimensions as well. So we assess the biological sustainability of the stock, we assess the ecosystem impact of the fishery operations, we also assess the effectiveness of the fisheries management system that underpins both of those other objectives. The way this is scored is by the performance of a fishery being evaluated against a number of different performance indicators. Each one of those performance indicators is scored to evaluate whether they meet a level of performance consistent with what we deem the minimum acceptable, which is SG60, some of the terminology we might encounter later, or it meets best practice, that's SG80, or it meets SG100, which is the state-of-the-art performance level. In order to be certified, a fishery must reach 80 per principle on average, and it must reach 60 across all of the individual performance indicators. This is quite relevant because some of the changes that we're talking about will come in at different levels in the scoring system, and I'll hopefully contextualise that as and when we come to it. Revising our standard has been quite a long process. It's taken about 4 years and has been the most comprehensive revision of our fisheries standard to date. The MSC has now been around for about 25 years. So we've gone through our awkward adolescence, and we're now in this realm where, as a mature organisation, we need to make sure that our products are fit for purpose and able to be applied consistently globally. So we've undertaken quite a rigorous evaluation of our standard across many different dimensions of what it covers. This resulted in 16 separate in-depth projects, and these projects can be as broad as the fact that harvest strategies has been but one aspect, but one project. So we had 16 different projects which we investigated. We went through a number of rounds of consultation, significant internal and external research and development went into producing the requirements, and then significant impact testing of the resulting requirements to ensure that they deliver the impact that we intend them to deliver. We have the benefit of more than 20 years experience now, which means we have a lot of data on how fisheries have performed against previous versions of the standard, and we have a good understanding of what fisheries can and can't do in order to deliver sustainability. That has informed how we have determined where to set the bar. Our new standard has been guided by one overriding principle, which is that we need to reflect the global evolution and uptake of fisheries management best practice. Our standard is not static. It reflects the way the world changes, but it reflects the way that it changes on the water. So that means that we are focused on evaluating what changes need to be implemented where people have already identified solutions and applied them in various contexts that we can then operationalise and apply more broadly. So our theory of change is premised on not necessarily MSC finding the answer to a particular problem, but looking around the world to find out how individual fisheries and stakeholders have addressed problems in their own context and then drawing the lessons from that to apply globally. This will then result, even for fisheries that are currently certified, in an expectation that they will need to raise their performance in key areas. A lot of that is down to the fact that many fisheries around the world will meet best practice for many of the dimensions of the standard that they're already assessed against. But there may be other jurisdictions in the world that have grappled with a particular problem. They've learned how to solve something. We've then taken that on board in our standard, and they will be expected to improve to reflect that new level of best practice as applied. So this is not the MSC seeking to set out some future standard that is impossible to achieve. We're trying to set a standard that is reflective of best practice now as it can be applied over the coming years. And we hope that above all, this will ensure that MSC certified fisheries continue to be recognised as world leaders in sustainability. I would be very surprised if there are many fisheries, even among those that are certified, get certified against this new standard and do not find that they have to make some form of improvement. That is just implied in the way that we have set this standard. But I would also say that those improvements will vary quite considerably across fisheries, and part of what we're going to talk about today will highlight the changes that are relevant, particularly for tuna fisheries. First, we'll begin with endangered, threatened and protected species. This is a topic that many stakeholders have very dear to their hearts. It's also been an area of the standard that was not reviewed in significant detail in our last standard review. So our last standard review concluded back in about 2016. We released a standard that became, actually 2014, it became effective. In 2017, we started to see broad-scale uptake of that new standard. But we didn't make changes to ETP, and this is an area that has changed considerably in the way that fisheries manage their interactions with ETP species around the world. So as a result of that, we've made some important changes here. One of the big ones is how we define or designate what an ETP species is. Those species are the ones that need to then be treated under these particular requirements. Many jurisdictions, many nations have ways of defining what an ETP species is. It is not very consistent. Particularly for tuna fisheries, given the level of overlap between different fisheries, having some level of consistency in treatment of these species is incredibly important, so that one fishery operating in the same place, when it's assessed, has the same outcome as another fishery. So we needed to come up with a universal way of designating ETP species. What we've done is decided that all marine mammals, seabirds, reptiles and amphibians are automatically going to be treated as ETP. In addition, we have a process for determining how finfish or invertebrates will be treated as ETP. And if there is a good argument with sufficient evidence, it may be possible that something that is designated as ETP, that is a finfish, may be able to be treated as an in-scope species. So we've gone through this process to try to get consistency globally in how these species are treated. For any species that are ETP, we are going to raise the level of performance that's expected. We're introducing quite strict new requirements that fisheries must minimise their mortality. This is above and beyond not hindering recovery of populations. So if you interact with a species, even if the population is healthy, we still expect you to minimise your mortality of these species. And then, in addition, we've set a much more clear-cut population goal for where we expect you to reach, which is that you will reach a level of performance where the fishery can be said to have allowed a population to be at favourable conservation status. This is defining the equivalent of BMSY for ETP species. It's a new reference point. It's a conceptual way of defining what good looks like when it comes to ETP, which has been very inconsistent around the world. We've drawn very heavily on a number of best practice examples in setting this threshold, which hopefully gives an unambiguous target of where we expect you to manage these fisheries towards. and these interactions. We've also clarified the way that we score ETP species as well to make that more straightforward. When it comes to shark finning, fins naturally attached policies will now be required across the board. This means that for any fishery that retains sharks, it will need a fins naturally attached policy. Before, when I was talking about our scoring guideposts, this is one of the important ones where it comes up. The changes here kick in at SG60, which means that this is effectively a requirement or else a fishery will fail. So it needs these policies in place in order to be able to be assessed under the new standard and to pass. We're also introducing evidence requirements that will underpin assessing that fins naturally attached policies are in place. And we've defined the term shark to accommodate all of the kinds of species that are most frequently encountered through the shark fin trade. And in fact, our definition, I think, reflects something like 99% of the species that were encountered in surveys of, for example, some of the markets in Hong Kong and other places. Gear loss and ghost fishing. This is another topic that has been raised by many stakeholders and deemed to be quite an important one. We've introduced new requirements here to make explicit what previously had been only implicit in our standard, which is that gear loss is something that fisheries will need to manage directly. So here, management strategies must be in place for fisheries to address any gear that they lose, and for the purposes of ghost gear, we include FADs. So loss of FADs, you need management strategies to address that, and that will be required in order to be able to meet the level of performance in the standard. The evidence requirements framework. And this is probably one of the achievements I'm proudest of in our new standard. It underpins the way that we evaluate the information used for fisheries assessments and make sure there's adequate information to underpin fisheries management on a daily basis. We've got a new method for systematically evaluating this information. This will then hopefully improve the consistency and deal with the potential for perverse incentives that we've previously had a lot of feedback about, that certain fisheries that seem to have a lot of information somehow felt that they were held to a higher standard than fisheries that had less information. This consistent underpinning is to drive improvement and to ensure that everyone starts from a common baseline. This should hopefully increase the confidence of fisheries assessments, but it also should be highlighted. We've raised the level of performance expectation as well, and one of the main areas that this changes is that we will now require independent observation. This could be through things like observers or cameras or many other systems, that we require independent observation for fisheries at SG80, and particularly for fisheries, and again this is very relevant for tuna fisheries, for fisheries that operate on the high seas, we require a minimum of 30% coverage unless your RFMO has introduced a science-based measure to set a different threshold. So that's 30% will be expected in order to reach SG80. So this is a very high level of expectation, and it is geared towards providing evidence that can underpin fisheries assessments in places that previously we've found the consistency of evidence has been quite variable. So hopefully that will address that. Now we'll move on to the main topic for today. Harvest strategies. Harvest strategies has perhaps more than any other issue been one of the challenges that tuna fisheries have faced over the last while in terms of addressing conditions and making sure that the performance that is delivered is able to meet our standard. We've had a lot of feedback from stakeholders over the years, but perhaps before we jump into what we're doing, because this is our deep dive, I'd like to give a little bit more context. What do we currently require? Our current requirements are that fisheries must reach what we refer to as a best practice level of harvest strategies, which means they must have what is called a well-defined harvest control rule. And that well-defined harvest control rule is a way of linking the management activities to changes in stock performance at its heart. Put simply, if you don't have this, it's very unlikely that you will respond to changes in stock status. This is the lesson from fisheries management around the world. So a well-defined harvest control rule is best practice in fisheries management and is present in the current standard. Fisheries not reaching that level will either potentially receive a condition if they have some of the components of an effective harvest strategy but maybe not all elements, or they may fail if they don't have that. So what we're looking for here at the moment under our current standard is fisheries being able to reach that SG80 level. And this applies to all fisheries, including those that are RFMO managed fisheries. Now, going into our standard review, we identified two main challenges when it came to our harvest strategy requirements. The first, and I think I'm probably not saying anything too much that's new to anyone in this room, but agreeing harvest control rules in RFMOs has proven to be quite difficult. Many people have, at the risk of stating the bleeding obvious, it's worth noting this as one of the premises that was raised as we undertook this investigation. So the question was, well, how can we better catalyse this? This was one of the first questions. But perhaps the other part of the problem wasn't as well appreciated outside of those who had been looking at this very closely. And that is, even in circumstances where fisheries had adopted well-defined harvest control rules or had other mechanisms to try to address this, we still weren't always seeing the outcomes we expected. So the way I've put this is well-defined harvest control rules are necessary, but they may not be sufficient on their own to drive the outcome that we are looking to achieve. In other words, we're faced with this quandary. We simultaneously recognise that it's hard to achieve the level of performance we've already set, but also recognising even reaching that level of performance isn't enough to solve the underlying sustainability problem. So how do we cut this Gordian knot? Perhaps, though, recognising that that second problem is something that's a bit more new to people, and it might be worth unpacking a bit why we actually came to this conclusion that even having a well-defined harvest control rule isn't necessarily sufficient. So if you'll beg my indulgence, we're going to depart from the tuna world very briefly to look at the Northeast Atlantic. I'm looking in Tom's direction at the moment. This is an area where we have seen quite significant departures from scientific advice in the setting of catch limits. So ICES sets, for those who are not familiar with this particular context, we have a complex of species which are fished, which have been fished by many member governments. So there's many member nations involved in this, and they have collectively set catch limits, but respecting their own individual fisheries management approach. The sum of their total quotas, though, has routinely exceeded scientific advice, and has done so in many cases for more than a decade. That's clearly not going to drive long-term sustainable outcomes. So perhaps those of you in the know could predict what my next slide would be here. Stock status. We're starting to see all of these stocks go in the wrong direction. And it's indicative of the fact that fisheries management, to be frank, isn't managing. In this instance, there is no constraint on the catch. And by not having a constraint on the catch, even if the quota is set, it is set too high, we're now seeing stock status reflect that reality of overfishing taking place. And so recognising this is one of the lessons from a circumstance where, to be frank, we have some of the best managed fisheries in the world present in these jurisdictions, and people have been grappling with this problem for some years, maybe this is a circumstance that is something that we need to pay attention to. Then we come to the Indian Ocean. So now a tuna example. And I heard mention of yellowfin the other day, but I'm actually going to talk to you about a different example. I'm going to talk to you about skipjack, which has not necessarily been a problem, but it's a bit of a canary in the coal mine. Here, what we have is a harvest control rule that had been agreed in 2016, which resulted in the fishery that had spent a long time working on this, closing a condition that had been open for years to address this particular issue. They introduced a new harvest control rule that met our standard. It was well defined, and that meant that they were able to close their condition. But then we come to this important point, and it's going to be a bit of a theme on the following slides. In the absence of an allocation system, they didn't have a mechanism to actually put this in place in a way that delivered the outcome. Let's have a look what happened over the course of the next few years. Here's the catch in, forgive me, the text is a little small, in 2017. And what you can see is a catch level that was achieved that's more than 500,000 tonnes. The scientific advice was 470. The next year, we come to 2018, we have 607. And it was the same catch limit. Then we have an update to a stock assessment that took place in 2020. Here, the catch level is 555. We would have expected now, with the updated stock assessment, maybe we're following it. No, we're still overcatching it by 40,000 tonnes. So as a result of this, this fishery has now reopened its harvest strategy condition. And the reason why is because as important as having all the elements of an effective harvest strategy are, they've proven to be necessary but not sufficient to actually stop overfishing and to drive the proper management of the stock, which is ultimately what our harvest strategy requirements are geared to achieve. We don't want to tell people to stop fishing unnecessarily. We want them to fish in the right way that they can fish that way in perpetuity. Fishing this way is not possible in perpetuity. You will result in stock collapses. So that's why we have had to refine our harvest strategy requirements to address this reality, but also recognising this complex issue of it's already difficult to agree what we've had to agree, but now we need to go further. So how do we deal with that? What we came to is that we believe constraint mechanisms are necessary. You need some way of operationalising a harvest strategy to make it effective. And that also, our current requirements, because they were drafted based on global best practice, they didn't necessarily reflect the complexities of RFMO-based management. So we had these two conclusions. So how do you put that together? We also had unambiguous feedback from our stakeholders on the consensus on the need for harvest strategies supported by MSC certification, which was reassuring. So there was a sense that MSC's role in this space, the fact that this is on the RFMO agendas, there's been work in these particular areas, was critically important. So what we're introducing now, and if you only take one slide from the presentation, I'd be advising you to take this one on board. We're introducing now new requirements, specific milestones for delivering state-of-the-art harvest strategies. A higher level of performance will be expected. But also, we are requiring constraints on catch or effort that will deliver that harvest strategy in practice. But the trade-off to this is that this is quite difficult, and we know it's already been hard to agree harvest strategies. So we are going to give additional time and provide a much clearer roadmap what needs to be done to achieve this. Because we recognise what's happened to date. There's been a sense of we'll work towards a harvest strategy eventually without necessarily providing that blueprint. We're providing the blueprint more clearly, we hope, this time. This, we hope, will result in fisheries working together towards shared deadlines. This has been a common feature that we've found over time with our RFMO work. We've often had requests from fisheries to align their timeframes so people could work together. So this is now explicit in the way that this will actually work in practice. And I would also say, those that move to the new annex in order to address this particular challenge, as we'll go through in a bit more detail, will be encouraged to adopt the new standard in full. So that's also an incentive here. It means if there is more time, the trade-off to that is you might need to improve performance in other areas. We have two ways that this will be applied in practice. For those stocks, those tuna stocks that have never been certified before, so this means there has never been an MSC certification on the stock at all, you'll have up to 10 years to address this issue. And I won't go through this in detail. There is a handout that is available, and I encourage you, it will also be available digitally for those who don't want an extra piece of paper to carry. But the handout will give you a lot more details on this, but I'll talk through it a little bit. For those who are on uncertified stocks, they will have 10 years to address this. And those 10 years will be broken into two phases: to develop the harvest strategy and then implement it in that management regime. And that includes securing agreement on things like catch constraints. So those steps are laid out, and it's hopefully reasonably clear in the documents we're providing to you. For certified stocks, recognising that many of these stocks have had a long time to work on this particular challenge already, we have said a shorter period of time is appropriate. We previously consulted on allowing just 2 years for these stocks, but we received strong feedback from many stakeholders saying it's unrealistic to try to address catch constraint mechanisms being introduced in as little as 2 years, which we fully understand. So on that basis, reflecting the stakeholder feedback we received, we've given 5 years. 5 years is the typical length of a certificate. It also gives reasonable certainty to all that are involved, But it's also not giving 10 years for all fisheries. It's giving 5 years for those that have previously been certified. And again, this means if any fishery has ever operated, been certified on a given stock, that will then suggest it's 5 years. Now, the obvious question, at the risk of jumping into the Q&A early, is what does this mean for the WCPO? Because I know a lot of people will be quite interested in that. I would say, in summary, there are 2 recommendations I would make. There needs to be agreement of harvest strategies this year for skipjack, irrespective of what we're introducing. There are many reasons for it. I'm happy to go into them in more in depth in the Q&A, but this should not be seen as the MSC thinking that harvest strategy adoption this year is unimportant. Far from it, it couldn't be more important because everyone has a higher mountain to climb now than they did before. And so making a start this year is critical. But in addition to that, adopting the new annex will provide a blueprint to get everyone together to try to resolve the catch constraint issue. So we would encourage the early adoption of that new annex for all fisheries in order to address this challenge collectively over the coming years. There are big reasons why this is necessary. I've highlighted a few examples where it's not necessarily going the way we would hope, but in other places too. If you look at the climate change projections for what's going to play out in this particular ocean basin, it suggests that people might want to put in place proper catch constraints soon. And I think that's something that probably is worth reflecting on, is there's a lot of external drivers that sit behind this as well. It's not just for the short-term management of the fishery. There are external factors you will need to be bearing in mind. Obviously, MSC certified fisheries represent a large chunk of the players here. We're hoping everyone is able to step up and help us out in achieving this really important objective. So with that, hopefully not too far off time, I shall pause and thank you all and wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan. As I said earlier, when everybody registered to attend this event, quite a number of people submitted questions beforehand. So I'm going to start off about a half a dozen of those questions, Rohan, which are indicative of groupings of questions, which I'm sure are on a lot of people's minds. Some are regarding the harvest strategies, but on other topics as well. So a question is, how does the new standard cover the social aspects of fishing?
So we've introduced a new social policy scheme document, and this gives me an opportunity to give a plug for Bill's talk tomorrow, where Bill will actually be talking us through what we're doing on social in the main session. But our main change here is we've introduced a new scheme document. This new document basically summarises everything that we're currently doing, or we currently expect on social, which means no forced or child labour is permitted in any MSC certified fisheries or supply chains. For supply chains, there is the possibility of audits being conducted, social audits being conducted, and that needs to be factored in by certificate holders. For fisheries, we are still going at the moment with a self-description approach, where you must describe the policies and procedures that you are taking to address any forced or child labour issues. Above and beyond that, we're also exploring the introduction of requirements around human rights policies and also grievance mechanisms. We're still at the exploratory phase on that, but we are looking at that and considering it quite seriously. That will unfold through its own consultation over time. But we are looking at this area. We recognise it's a rapidly evolving space. We're very cautious about the fact that it's still early days with many of the initiatives that have been suggested here. We would like to see how some of those play out and work with others to make sure that we have an enduring solution on social.
Thank you. So now you can skip my presentation tomorrow. Another question here is, how does the new standard deal with marine mammals interactions and specifically with dolphins in the catch?
Thank you, Bill. So I would say we're dealing with this in a couple of different ways. If the bycatch is incidental, then our ETP requirements, unambiguously, all marine mammals, dolphins, anything like that, you must deal with them under the ETP requirements, which means you cannot hinder recovery to favourable conservation status, and you must minimise your catch. So there's an expectation that over time you're reducing your catch and you're implementing best practice mitigation measures to address that. For fisheries where there is marine mammal catch is associated with an activity where they could be deemed to be harassing marine mammals, and it's integral to the fishing operation. At the request of our Technical Advisory Board, we have introduced a new requirement. Previously, we were considering ruling such fisheries out of scope of our program. We've opted not to do that and instead set a much higher sustainability threshold for those fisheries to achieve. So those fisheries will still be able to seek certification, but the only way they will be able to do it is if every 5 years they produce an estimate of population size that indicates not only that they're not hindering recovery to favourable conservation status, but that they have achieved favourable conservation status. This is to resolve any questions whatsoever about sustainability impact that happen in those fisheries.
Thank you. Next one is, how does the new standard deal with the sustainability and impact of drifting fads?
I would say through a number of different ways. So a drifting fad could potentially have entanglement of animals that it encounters. So that could be potentially the bycatch of in-scope species or out-of-scope species, such as ETP species. It could also be entangled on reefs and things like that, so it could be a habitat impact, plus the ghost gear requirements. So if you have a fishery that involves a FAD component, there'll be a number of different parts of the standard where you will need to meet a level of performance. In some cases, that is raised from version 2.0. Our habitat requirements haven't changed substantively. We've changed definitions and hopefully clarified a number of points, but we've not necessarily sought to raise the bar, just more consistently apply the bar that we've put in place with version 2. But in all of the other areas that I've identified, there is a higher level of performance that's expected.
Thank you. Another one on e-monitoring. How does the new standard support and encourage electronic monitoring and e-observer data and standards?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. That's actually a really important one. It relates to, I think, as I alluded to, one of my pet areas of the standard that I'm most proud of, which is introducing this evidence requirements framework. So having this higher level of information being expected, all fisheries at SG80 will need to be able to say they have independent observation of their catches. Independent observation can be electronic. And in fact, that may be the easiest and most pragmatic way to scale this out. In fact, as I know many of people are exploring right now. So introducing that would be a very good step to addressing and reaching the level of performance for SG80 in the standard. But if you operate in the high seas, because of the fact it is so much harder to undertake other forms of independent observation, you can't necessarily have boarding and inspection done as easily and things like that. We've introduced this threshold and said 30% must be observed unless your RFMOs set a science-based target different than that. So 30%, and that can be dealt with at a fleet level. So fleets can solve this by having their own electronic monitoring approach that covers up to 30% or covers 30% or more of their activities.
Okay. So the bulk of the remainder of the questions all had to do with the harvest strategies and the early application of Section SE and deadlines. And there were maybe 20 different people had questions on this. Maybe I'll throw it open to the floor now for those people with those specific questions so that Rohan can answer that directly. And so if you have a question, let me know, identify yourself, and I'll hand the microphone to you. You can do questions not related to that as well.
Sorry, thanks. So Rohan, thanks for the presentation. It was really good, really helpful.
Thank you.
So related to your last response about EM reporting, I was wondering if you could identify specific requirements for determining the independence of evidence other than government-managed monitoring programs. So like you mentioned, industry-run EM, for example.
Yeah, so the requirement is that it is independent observation, but independent could be determined through a number of means. I will say we're likely to, and probably this is relevant for many of the questions. If we risk getting into the weeds in areas where I could say, yes, but it's in guidance and it's not sufficient, I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. But this is a classic where defining what constitutes independent observation was actually something that was discussed quite extensively by our Stakeholder Advisory Council and our Technical Advisory Board, because rightly they raised the question, well, what is independent? I think the intent here is that we can have confidence that the data is representative of the activities it purports to cover. That's what we're looking for. So the way that you could demonstrate that is by having independence at a number of stages in the process. And I think the way that we will define that in the standard will make that clear, what sort of kinds of evidence collection would be appropriate to demonstrate sufficient independence. But happy to talk in more detail about it, Eric, if that's not sufficient.
Thank you. My name is Pink from Mars Pet Care. Thank you very much. Very informative presentation. I had a follow-up question on the social standards a little bit because actually I'm a human rights background. So I'm interested to know a little bit, have you assessed the self-declarations, the quality of those self-declarations? And you mentioned a little bit about vessel audits. And I'm wondering, based on those requirements, what kind of feedback has been gotten from those social audits on those vessels? And I don't know if you can comment, or that's going to be covered by your session tomorrow. But if not today, then maybe you can cover it tomorrow. Great.
Maybe I'll have a swing and then Bill can get the right answer tomorrow for you. First of all, this gives me an opportunity to give a little bit of a plug to some analysis that we did on this. We recently had it published in Marine Policy, going through all of self-descriptions we've received from all of the MSC certified fisheries. So I actually undertook fairly detailed piece of analysis to go through and find out how different fisheries have addressed forced and child labour. So we've done the research ourselves now, and we understand what good looks like across the fisheries that are able to be certified. So in this sense, having a self-description step has been incredibly important for us because it's collected a lot of evidence that up until now, I think, to be frank, had been assumed as to how people solve this problem. We've now got the direct information to work from. So that's given us a first step towards saying, well, what can fisheries do? What are they doing? We've heard a lot from fisheries that they're undertaking audits, but what we've also heard is that the level of audit and the approach with auditing, first party, second party, third party, government audits, all sorts of different types, varies tremendously. It also varies, it seems to be, by different product classes and fishery type as much as it does across the sector based on different geographies. So coming up with a one-size-fits-all solution on social seems to be a mythical thing that we're searching for, and I suspect that's not actually going to work in practice. What we need to do is understand what are the solutions that are working in different contexts and work out how we can recognise and incentivise people to adopt them. So we've got the baseline work done, but what we now need to go through is working out, well, what the next appropriate steps are. And I think that's going to be that's a process where MSC is not going to do it on its own. It wants to work with others, and it needs to engage with stakeholders and understand what's been successful and what hasn't worked and why. And I know people in this room have had social audits done of their vessels. I want to hear whether it worked or not. What came from that? And we can understand what's very useful and what is less useful. So we're still in that information and gathering and learning phase.
Hey Rohan, Hugh Jones, Control Union UK with one of the MSC cabs. Rohan, early adoption of Section SE starts in 2 weeks' time. Can you give me an update on the process so I know what to tell all of my clients, please?
That sounds like we should have a coffee chat. Hugh?
I think we need something a little bit stronger than that.
Look, so the reason why a lot of people are looking so nervously and enthusiastically at Section SE is, to be frank, I think a lot of fisheries are they're reading the tea leaves about December and they're getting nervous. That's one response that's appropriate, fair enough. But I would suggest another response that's appropriate right now is doubling down efforts to try and solve the problem. And particularly now, when I know a number of capitals are drafting conservation measures, going back, ringing the right phones, making the right calls to the right people is also a useful exercise. So by all means, people should be thinking about Section SE and what they need to apply, particularly for those stocks that are not likely to have progress this year. So for example, there are a number of stocks where the harvest strategy development has not got to the point where it would need to in order to close a condition by next year. Those fisheries know know their circumstances, they should be anticipating this, and the process is being worked on, Hugh, largely to accommodate the fact that we recognise what that timeline is. So it will come. But the reality is, there is also an opportunity here for agreement that will make a big difference in December. And I think that's also where the efforts need to be focused. So it's a partial answer here, and buttonhole me later. Any further questions?
Hi, Rohan. Matt Hall, Starkist. Question around the evidence requirements. So you mentioned 30% expectation for observer coverage on the high seas to get to SG 80. With the new standard, what will the expectations be to get to SG 60?
Excellent question. Thanks, Matt. What we've proposed at SG 60 across the board for our evidence requirements is that there's independent verification. What this recognises, and it's the presence of it, it's not a specific threshold. And this is because there are different ways that fisheries can verify their catch, and those can involve things like dockside monitoring or boarding and inspection or other approaches that they can apply that do not necessarily involve real-time monitoring of every single haul or set. Right? There are approaches like that that can be applied. We deem that to be the minimum acceptable because it is broadly applied across the world, and there are a whole suite of tools that you can deploy that are suitable for your fishery. When you get to best practice, we're now looking at, okay, this is what the pace setters are doing. The pace setters all have independent observation. And they have it through things like cameras, or they have it with human observers. The specific level is unique to the RFMOs because of their context. I will say that's been one of our big lessons through this standard review process, is the RFMO context is not the same as domestic fisheries context in terms of applying best practice. And so we have been more prescriptive there, largely because we've found that best practice has not necessarily always been as clear. So hopefully that answers your question, Matt.
Hi, Rohan. Tom Pickerel, Global Tuna Alliance. What's to stop a fishery that's currently certified from withdrawing from the standard and then re-entering assessment as an uncertified fishery to get 10 years to implement a harvest strategy?
Two things. One, if they do that, they're not eligible to re-enter assessment because they've failed to close a condition and they haven't satisfied the reason why they've failed to close a condition. That's already out against our rules. But the second thing is they're still operating on a stock that has previously been certified, even if they re-enter. So they'll still have 5 years.
Thank you. Just to follow up, sorry, I'm being a bit greedy here. But on the uncertified fishery slide, you've got until 2034 if a fishery enters. That's 2 further MSC standard reviews. Is there going to be any freezing of further discussion on this so we don't have another rollover in subsequent years?
So this is also, thank you very much for the question on that one, Tom. This is something we haven't talked about, which is the rollout of the new standard and potentially a new standard review cycle. Lest I have even less hair than what I currently have, we're not commencing a new standard review anytime soon. The reality is we're not going to have a new standard review commence until at least 5 years after release. So we're interpreting the 5-year review as commencing from the release of the standard, and that's deliberate. Partly because how do you collect data on the rollout of a new standard until it's actually applied in practice? And we're mandated by the FAO to allow at least 3 years to come into compliance. So that means at best we will have 2 years data from existing certified fisheries by the time that 5 years rolls around. So we're not commencing a new standard review, so there won't be 2 reviews in that period of time. There will be at best 1. Whenever we undertake a standard review, we always identify the set of issues that we believe we need to tackle. We release that in our terms of reference at the outset. I think at that point, we will be doing a review of our harvest strategy requirements and evaluating are they fit for purpose. And if we conclude there's no need for change, we won't be reviewing that section. I would be looking for consistency in a lot of the areas that we have made significant changes here, if only for a monitoring and evaluation basis, to say nothing of the fact that industry are going to have to make significant changes in a number of areas, and maintaining that for at least some time to give stability is also critically important. So I would be very surprised if we're making major changes. Never say never, but I'd be surprised.
Hi, I'm Joy, quality specialist from Woolworths. I'm curious on the observer at the vessel, how it's going to be in the recent few years that MSC will have like a more observer to be at the vessel, or how it's going to be.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So the placing of observers on vessels ultimately will come down to the individual fisheries management system that the fishery operates under. So in this case, if a fishery has an expectation that it has a higher level of observer coverage or independent observation, they will need to advocate to their management agency that they increase that level of coverage. Now, in some cases, fisheries are moving towards introducing electronic monitoring. That's something that they can control, but they'll still need people to go through the footage. So the expectation, you don't remove the need for an observer, you change what their job is and where they're based. So you'll still need that function. So I would say fisheries are going to need to work with their management agencies to make sure there's sufficient capacity to address this. And 30% coverage, particularly for RFMO areas, is quite high. So it will require quite a bit of footage to be evaluated to have that covered.
Thanks. Sorry to make you walk so far, Bill. So I'm Martin Purvis of the International Pole and Line Foundation. I just wanted some clarity on the observer coverage at SG80 for a non-high seas tuna fishery operating within economic zone only, because I think you said the 30% only applies to high seas areas. So what would that look like?
That's correct, Martin. So our expectation there is we haven't set a threshold. We've said independent observation, and the hope with that and the way we've framed it is that it's around answering the questions relevant for that fishery to manage its impacts, in particular on things like endangered, threatened and protected species. The reason why they're relevant, they tend to be rarer events, and as a result you tend to need a higher proportion of coverage to address that issue. So generally speaking, if you've got enough coverage for ETP species, you've got enough overall. So that's the reason why we've focused on that. So there'll be a specific question for the fishery to answer of what level of coverage would be appropriate for that fishery to answer those questions. But they wouldn't have to apply the 30% as a blanket rule.
Rohan. Marcelo Hidalgo from the Fishing Industry Association of Papua New Guinea. But well, it's a question regarding the other side of the Pacific Ocean, dolphins, setting nets on dolphins. You mentioned that harassing mammals, setting net, now you are going to increase the VAR, requesting reports every year?
5 years.
Every 5 years. From the fleet or RFMO level?
So the report is not about marine mammal interactions. It's an estimate, an independent estimate of population size, demonstrating that the population has recovered to favourable conservation status. So that could be done by anyone that is independent from the fishery. Doesn't necessarily have to be done by the RFMO. Can be done by independent university. It's fine. The point is you need an unambiguous answer to the question, has that population recovered?
Thank you.
Any more for any more?
Just going down my list if there's no one else asking a question. So, for the ETP bycatch minimization requirement, I was wondering if you might get into the weeds just a little bit on the guidance to the cabs on what constitutes adequate minimization and maybe using seabird bycatch as a example.
Yeah, it's a very good question actually, because this is one that we've grappled with quite hard, is how the heck do you measure when you're approaching zero? Which is actually a very difficult thing to demonstrate. So rather than trying to prove a negative, trying to prove that you're approaching zero, the positive thing, the thing that's auditable, is actually, are you implementing the measures that in other contexts have been demonstrated to achieve that outcome? So what we're looking at primarily is your population in a good place? And do you have the right management measures in place that have worked elsewhere to deliver successful mitigation? So that's what we're going to look for, and that hopefully will make it easier, because otherwise you get into a debate about when is a 1 a 0 and things like that, which is actually very difficult. What's far more important than the number is the operations overall being appropriate and the population consequences being completely resolved. And those two questions would be sufficient to say you've minimised.
Thank you. I'm Luciano from Bolton. Ron, can you please say something more about the improvement on ghost gear and lost FAD, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luciano. This is one of those areas that a lot of people have been asking for quite some time. In our previous standard, what we expected was that fisheries did not have the unintended impacts of gear that was lost on stocks that they might be targeting or interacting with, that they factored that into the assessment of those stocks. So I was mainly worried about like inadvertent fisheries mortality. That was our focus, and it was partly to go back to our primary focus was sustainability. Could you make sure that those stocks weren't being hindered in their ability to recover because of ghost gear? We've now gone a step further than that to say that it's not just enough to know that the stocks are sustainable. You probably shouldn't be having that gear just lost, even if it isn't having a detrimental impact that you can explicitly measure. So the expectation now is that fisheries have to have a management strategy in place to deal with that. So we're not prescriptive. You've got several different ways of solving that problem because fisheries will have different ways of doing it. And we know that that varies wildly by gear type as to what kind of gear loss you might encounter. But they will need this strategy and they'll need to be able to demonstrate it's effective to the conformity assessment bodies. And they could potentially attract a condition if they don't address that explicitly. So that's what we're hoping for. I would also say there's a lot of stakeholder interest in this particular one, but it's one of those areas where we found relatively early on in the review process, we found a lot of common ground between industries and NGOs, because to be frank, no one wants to lose gear. It's expensive, it's difficult to deal with, and it doesn't really benefit anyone. And I think that shared recognition was one of the reasons why we landed on a solution there that I hope is able to be applied more broadly. Oh, sorry. Others might not be able to hear you, so.
Hi, Jeremy from Safet. Just a quick follow-up, like on fads, I suspect you're talking about drifting fads or all types of fads?
Well, so when it comes to ghost gear, lost gear in whatever form, and for the purposes of ghost gear, we're deeming a fad to be, because I know there's a big debate about whether a fad is a gear or not, but for our purposes, the loss of a fad is a form of ghost gear, but that doesn't matter if it's a drifting fad or an anchored fad. If you lose the gear, you're potentially having a consequence. So I'd be looking to understand, well, do you have some understanding of the level of loss that is happening? And it might be for anchored fads, it's far less frequent, but I'll bet it's not zero. So you then need to think about, if it is non-zero, what are you doing? Is there a way to check that? Do you have some sense of that? Do you have some way of addressing it? It might be you improve the design of your anchoring system rather than you go out and collect the fads you've lost, for example. But whatever your solution is, you need some way to be able to demonstrate you've thought about the issue and grappled with it and hopefully addressed it fully.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We're going to be around for another hour or so. If you're too shy to speak in public and ask a question, you can ask a question of Rohan or myself or Laura in the background there. We're happy to have a chat with you, have a drink. There's some nibbles in the back, so please enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Thank you all.